On today's episode of That Zombie Show, we learned that Mussolini did absolutely nothing wrong.
Save for losing the war and ending up dead, but details.
And to be fair, that maps on very well to today's episode as well. Yes.
It does, almost to a T. It's almost like we have a repeating story. Like history repeats itself, you know what they say.
Somebody has a very based take on Mussolini's rise to power.
We basically cover it in 2 episodes.
So, today we're talking about episode 4 and 5, because we weren't around for 4, and 5 was sped up due to National Egg Kicking Championship in America, apparently. I don't know, quite enough point advantage of it. There you go.
A weird thing, okay? It's just a thing we do. You're gonna have to accept it.
It happens, apparently. And so episode 4, okay, not that much necessarily happens in episode 4. I think talking about this as just more of a super episode is more apt, honestly.
Yeah, because most of the story beat continues over to the next part. In fact, they leave it on such a dull cliffhanger too. Which is like, yep, you're gonna have to wait till the next episode to get the rest of the information you need.
Yes.
The context.
Because we're introduced to a city, and the city used to be run by FEDRA, and FEDRA used to be bad dudes over here. Like, they engaged in a little bit of recreational rape, for example, the odd game of torture the immigrants, stuff like that. Or at least
usual practices.
So we are told. And that is one of the key problems here. We are told a lot of things. And okay, so as far as I understand, in the game, this segment is basically you just kill a bunch of bandits. And these guys are mostly just bandits, but there's a bit of a backstory that FEDRA were assholes and that they rose up against FEDRA. Okay, fair enough. But here, they've tried to make this into something greater than that. And so we are introduced to Kathleen. And considering she ruins everything she touches, I believe her name shall be Kathleen Kennedy for the purposes of this video.
A fitting name, to be sure.
Indeed. Kathleen Kennedy is the Mussolini of our story, because her brother, Jesus, because he was perfect in every single way, he wanted a bloodless revolution. He wanted true socialism to finally rise up and kick out those mean FEDRA bastards, and then everyone would be happy. But he was betrayed by Henry, whose little brother had leukemia, and so he had to sell out Jesus to save his little brother with drugs. And Jesus was like, Kathleen Kennedy, please, don't mistreat my Star Wars. And she smiled and said, oh, of course, Jesus, I totally won't. Then they executed Jesus.
And then what happened to Star Wars? Damn. What a shame.
Well,
Star Wars being the city, of course.
Kathleen Kennedy then took Star Wars, his idea of a bloodless coup, and turned it into a screaming communist revolution, with people being dragged through the streets behind trucks, and people being barbecued alive and beaten to death with bats, etc.,
Yep, suspected collaborators to be given a fair trial, but, executed en masse.
Oh yes, I like that part too, like, we're not FEDRA, we'll give you a trial. You're all guilty. Wasn't that fun?
Yep, isn't that funny? She even says that, she's like, we're not FEDRA, you'll just work a little bit and, we'll let you readapt to society. Walks out of the room, kill them all. It's like, oh, you are FEDRA, okay.
Yes.
At least they became worse than the monsters they claimed to be overthrown.
And this is why I point to Mussolini, because this is basically his arc too, where he was a socialist, and then the revolution never happened, and then Mussolini decided to take things into his own hands, and then the revolution happened. Just like Kathleen Kennedy did.
Exactly the same, because her brother failed, and so she's like, fine, I'll just kill everyone and anyone that disagrees with me. And so the revolution kicked off to a horrifically bloody start, and ended with basically, I think their entire city's going to collapse, honestly.
Yeah, Kathleen Kennedy has made quite the mess of things. And in the middle of this, of course, comes Joel and Ellie, wandering around, and they see the city and is busted up, and Joel go like, hey, let's take the back road, I say. And then they can't because the plot intervenes. Like I goddamn told you to. They should have just driven through the city. I told you, straight through. No, they had to take the back road.
Well, they took back roads through the city. That's so they're like, we should take a back road. See, I'm thinking to myself, like, why don't they just drive around the urban centers? Because they already know that urban centers are something you should avoid to begin with. And they're like, no, we're gonna drive through the back roads of the city. Oh, okay, so through the city still. You're still driving through the city. You're just not on the highway. You're detouring in congested streets where maybe, FEDRA didn't actually get around to pushing the vehicles out of the way. Like, oh, think, Joel, think. What are you doing?
And then they get ambushed by the communists. They kill all the communists, which, good on them.
All three of them.
I suppose. Ellie wounds one of them and should also have put a slug in Pedro Pascal's guts, judging by the camera angle, but, it's movie tricks, and so he wasn't actually shot.
Yep, because one of the bandits was on top of Joel and was in the process of killing him, and then she, goes to help. But the way the camera is angled is it looks like she shoots through the guy and into Joel's gut. It's like, you need to raise that a little higher there, little missy. Or Joel's gonna have a gut wound and you're gonna be screwed.
And okay, here's the big thing, because okay, this is all right. This sounds all right because you're doing a story here, right? You're setting something up. You're setting up something bigger than just the traveling monologue. Kathleen Kennedy has a reason for what she's doing. She's not a monster because she chose to be. She's a monster because of circumstance. She's supposed to be a little bit of a tragic villain here. And you're supposed to sympathize with Henry, the collaborator, because he's together with Joel and Ellie, and he did his stuff for a reason as well. And when he's in danger, Joel and Ellie is in danger. It's meant to set up this kind of relationship where you're not sure who's really the bad guy here, Is Kathleen Kennedy's actions justified in some way, etc.? And it's clear that they're selling this very heavily. Like, they're meaning like, oh, this is so much more. But there's just not enough time. That Kathleen Kennedy comes across as just evil. There is no point in which she looks even remotely reasonable. Even though they have her talk in that way from the dude with the bat from The Walking Dead, who's all like, he's poster boy psychotic, because he's like, oh, well, aren't we just gonna have a good time and beat somebody to death,
Yep. She talks like, sort of like, what you'd imagine a neighborly, like, sort of American woman in, like, a suburbia to be like, oh, how you doing? That's such an unfortunate thing. Like a very nice lady, sort of cordial, if you will.
Yes.
And she's just a, sadistic murderer.
They're trying to make her sound like creepy, saying the nice words but actually being mean kind of thing. They're trying to get more effect out of her, but there's just not enough time to establish her to make this a good payoff. And this is where we need to bring the word back to the Bill and Frank episode, because I did say that so long as that episode didn't subtract from any of the other story, then it was totally cool and was just a nice little romance side story. But now it does subtract, because this story needed more time. And this story is much bigger and more important, because we're not talking about two gays in the woods. We're talking about an entire city community here.
Yep, and a revolution that occurs here that greatly shakes the foundations of the city and ultimately leads to the collapse of this little refuge of civilization.
Yeah, like there are hundreds of people who suffered and lived here and who made difficult choices and who eventually, led to their destruction. This is a much bigger storyline, and I feel like they're trying. It makes the Bill and Frank episodes stand out in a negative way, because for all of the episodes we're just following Joel and Ellie. And if that was all we did, I wouldn't have an issue with this, because they're just passing through, and the deep backstory of the areas that they're passing through in doesn't necessarily matter as much, because the story's focused on,
Joel and Ellie.
Yeah, Joel and Ellie, yeah. Except, of course, they broke that form with the Bill and Frank episode, where they did take us away from Joel and Ellie and focus on this couple of side characters for an entire episode. And so them returning to the Bill and Joel travel story now makes that feel so out of place.
Yep, especially considering that the first episode starts off with a good 20 minutes dedicated to just Joel and Ellie and building their characters as they're traveling in Bill's truck, which is pretty good. It's good character building. But the problem is when we enter the city, I don't remember if it's Kansas City or wherever, I think the story starts to fall apart because they're starting to rush, because they're covering the game aspects, but they're also like, okay, well, we need to expand the backstory about the revolution and what happened to FEDRA. And so they sort of touch on it a little bit, and then we get to the part 2 of the super episode. And part 2, they then try to expand on it with like a flashback, but the problem is it feels rushed. Everything about it just feels like, checkboxy.
Yeah,
when it comes to storytelling.
They clearly don't have enough time because they're trying to continue to elaborate on Joel and Ellie, who have some good scenes together here. Like the pun book, for example, was excellent stuff because he was cringy and relatable, and I liked it a lot. But then you're also trying to cover the story of Henry and his little brother. And you're also trying to cover the story of Kathleen and her brother. And you're also trying to cover the story of the revolution. And you're also trying to cover the story of how these rebels are sympathetic because they have to, kill some of them. And they're not supposed to be just bad guy bandits. And it's too much in too little time. And it makes the Bill and Frank episode feel like it's at fault for this. Because that was an entire episode, and you could have sliced off even just like 20 minutes would have made a big difference, but like you couldn't have done that either, because okay, now you're watching Bill and Frank and suddenly it cuts to Kansas City and these characters you've never met, that wouldn't work either.
Yeah, I think the problem is the change to Bill and Frank's story is only justifiable if the follow-up could maintain the flow. The issue is the follow-up floundered. It absolutely did, especially in these episodes. And so that means that the Bill and Frank episode is now detrimental. It's sort of like, it's exactly what everyone says about the Dune movie that came out recently. If the next part's bad, like, it's gonna ruin everything and nothing else matters. Same applies here, same logic. And that's the problem. Now, the Bill and Frank episode is no longer a tolerable episode. It is now a detriment to the show because now it is a waste of time when they clearly needed more time dedicated to building up this story. What the previous episode should have been is them passing through that region, interacting with them, and doing the same things in the video game, but by and large, a relatively short excursion.
Yeah, and they could have interacted with Bill and Frank more anyways. Like, they could have hung out with them for a couple of days. There could have been some flashback. They could have told them their story, But they should also have been laying the groundwork for this. Like, oh, hey, did you know that FEDRA over there, like, they're really mean? Like, are you sure? Oh, yeah, I heard some stories. Begin building it up a bit, setting the stage for what's going to happen. But they tried to do too much, and they didn't have enough time. So either they would have needed to do more, which meant cutting into the Bill and Frank storyline, or they would have to do less to maintain the sensation of this is just a traveling tale of Joel and Ellie. But if they did that too, it would still make the Bill and Frank episode feel out of place. Because it would now be the only episode that had basically no Joel and Ellie. So that was the episode that wasn't a traveling tale.
Yeah, they're trying to do too many things here. And, oh man, the thing is, it's also conflicting storytelling methods too. Because, let's talk about the Bill and Frank episode just real quick. Bill and Frank episode, we focus entirely on side characters. Alright, that's cool world building. You get to see more of what the video game didn't show and sort of like an alternate history even approach. But then we get to this next sequence, which could be really cool if you think about it, if they took like a side episode, a couple, to fully immerse yourself and explore the story of the city and its tale that it has to tell. The issue is they don't. They actually switch the method of storytelling completely in this one to being like a hodgepodge of chopped up arcs that are interspersed together. And it comes across as a mess. And then we got random flashbacks in the middle of it to try to quickly fill in keynotes and gaps. It's too much of a mess. There's no organization. And it leaves you feeling very dissatisfied, especially with the conclusion. But I think everybody thought the conclusion kind of was a bit of a wet fart.
The conclusion was so rushed too. So you've got Kathleen Kennedy. She's finally got them trapped after they've been pinned down by the world's worst sniper.
Yes.
And they're clearly fucked. Like, there's no saving them here. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, like, the zombies are gonna fucking arrive, aren't they?
Yep, because they telegraphed that.
Yeah, because it was the only way they were gonna get out of this predicament. And so, sure enough, the Deus Ex Machina swings into full effect and zombies just burst forth from the goddamn ground and attack the rebels. And they kill Santa Claus, and I have no idea who Santa Claus is. And that's the problem, too, because Santa Claus is almost as important a character as Kathleen Kennedy here. He's in every scene she's in, practically. Like, he's clearly another big guy on campus, right? And I know nothing about him.
The way the show presents this guy is he's the right-hand man, of Kathleen Kennedy. Like, he's the guy who gets shit done. He knows what he's doing, he's professional, and he is, most importantly, like, the go-getter. He is the brute, the thug, the guy that, the muscle of the operations. Well, she's like the brains or whatever. And he just sort of like dies in the sequence. And they also use the bloater, I want to point out as well, where it's a big fat chubby zombie and it's spongy, everybody knows. And has no tension. It just waddles up to him and just, rips his head off.
And it's not scary, okay. It's not satisfying, it's not even like, yeah, fuck Santa Claus. It's just, okay, that character died, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Even Kathleen Kennedy's death was like it was a little too cliche. Like, it was a little baby zombie that they had telegraphed earlier that was going after Ellie, ended up taking her out. And you're like, oh, it's like she's gonna get what she deserves. She's a horrible communist revolution that killed hundreds of people, and it just wails on her and just bites her neck
and that's the problem, like, because they haven't given me enough of a reason to care. Like, if they showed her like being in FEDRA camp, being tortured first, and then doing that torture to other people, I could have a conflicting story about her. And like, the way she dies, it feels like the show wants this to be a big deal, and it just isn't.
You kind of just don't care. Even the show immediately moves past that scene, and then it's like as if it never mattered, because they cross the bridge and then they leave the city limits.
Yeah, then it's done with. Like, they either needed to do a lot more with this, or they needed to do a lot less with this. And leaving it in the middle it's so unsatisfying.
Yeah, because the worst part is it's mildly interesting. You have, a communist revolution happening in the FEDRA sort of totalitarian regime-like structure, and so you've got a lot of interesting things going on here. And it doesn't really take time to explore those ideas or do much with those characters and their stories, even though you'd expect the show to do that, considering what it did with Bill and Frank, where it's like, let's try to expand a little bit more about who these characters are. It's like, okay, I'll bite to that. But here it's like, no, it's just too piecemealy, and it's not good or paced well.
I wasn't particularly fond of that, and again, the zombies just coming in at the end, like, hey, we're a plot device now.
The zombies, like, remember in the previous episode when the clickers showed up and there was tension in the air, and there's two of them, like, ooh, that's a lot, and then Tess sacrificed stuff, and there's a lot of them. It felt like that mattered, like a ton of them was like, ooh, that's very threatening. Here, there's like a ton of army dudes like shooting at or communist soldiers, and they get attacked by zombies, and it's just a big giant CGI, fight scene. And it sort of loses all sense of value because there's no real value to it. Like, it's just sort of too much stuff happening. Zombies are just more of like an obstacle for Ellie to escape through than an actual threat.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're just not really interesting anymore at this point.
You also have the final scene where Henry's little brother turns into a mushroom all of his very own. And again, it's also so telegraphed, and it's like, oh yeah, it's going to happen. He's like, I'm going to cure you. No, that's not going to work. And I see, again, the thing is, if this is just a traveling story, then I get it, because you can't have the side characters attach themselves to the main character's plot. That's just not how a traveling story works. The idea is you have the anchor in Joel and Ellie, and then you demonstrate how awful the world is surrounding them so as to increase the investment you have in the main characters. And that also does mean
Yes.
that you gotta, clear out the side characters, as they did here. But we've deviated too much from that, and we've tried to get... Like, the show is trying to get me invested now in the world, and that would be fine too. Like, if the entire show was like, okay, we're gonna do Bill and Joel, but we're gonna zoom out and give you the wide lens view. Because here's the thing, in the video game, a lot of the time you're playing is not actually used for storytelling. It's used for gameplay, sneaking, combat, etc. You could absolutely fill that time with the zoomed out view,
Yeah, definitely. That's again the issue of translating the media, and this is where they definitely floundered. Because let's try to expand on the notes they picked up. And it's like, you can try to do that, but you're also going to need to build on it, because those notes weren't really meant to be a full-blown storyboard sequence. Like, there's enough there to give you an idea of what's happening, and then through visual storytelling and audio cues from the other characters as you're sneaking by and they're talking to each other, if you choose to listen to them or kill them, you'll be able to piece the puzzle together yourself. But because this is an interactive media, the show now has to just sort of construct it, and it didn't take the time to construct it well. It was sloppily done, and that's why it doesn't feel very good or satisfying.
Yep. Which also what leaves this to be the weakest episode so far. And again, it really annoys me now that they spent so much time on side characters in the previous one, because this felt like a better use of the time.
Oh, definitely. This is infinitely more interesting too, because you have FEDRA, which is that, the remnants of the United States government. So it's an interesting entity. Then you've got these communist revolutionaries. They're also pretty interesting. These two factions vying for power. And then underneath all that, you got zombies, and underneath that, you got Joel and Ellie trying to escape through it. It sounds like such a recipe for such a cool sequence of story for a story to unfold. But here, just no. It more feels like a chore to watch.
Yeah,
which is not a good sign.
It does not do anywhere near as well as the previous episodes, in my opinion. Because the main meat of the previous episode was often the interactions and the character building between Joel and Ellie, and sneaking around the zombies. The clickers felt like a real threat. They felt scary and intimidating, and making their way through and finding the routes through the environment. And this didn't have much of that. It had the first 20 minutes of the fourth episode, it had character building between Joel and Ellie, and somewhat when they were fighting the bandits too, I guess, when he was teaching her kind of how to use the firearm. That was a good part, but then that all kind of stopped in favor of the side plot, and the side plot, which at the end of the day didn't really amount to anything.
Yep. Honestly, what they should have done with even if you could go back on the Bill and Frank thing, what they should have done is just focused on Joel and Ellie, and then just build these characters, because the relationship building of these two characters is following very close to the game, as in it's the main meat of the story. Them, Joel basically slowly becoming more of a humanized person and stop being so cold towards Ellie is a really nice thing to see, and their interactions that they play off each other, and you sort of see a father-daughter relationship between these two characters form. That's more interesting, and to watch and both see unfold than it is to see a poorly baked coup d'etat take place.
Yep. We'll have to see how this continues forward in the preceding episodes, but this was definitely the weakest entry so far, and soured me on that Bill and Frank episode too. I know we probably sound a little bit hooked up on that, but I actually genuinely quite liked it, and I wanted it to be a good addition to the story, and yet now it feels like a detriment.
Now it feels like a waste of space.
It does. It's okay, it was a decent romance, sure, but it was not as interesting as the overthrow of, an entire local government.
Yeah, that was cool, because I would like to, if you're gonna expand on the story of The Last of Us, show us the Civil War and whatnot. If I could have the Bill and Frank episode, or a cool civil war between FEDRA and the citizenry, I'll take the FEDRA and citizenry, because that actually has more to do with the universe, and we can see how society like what's wrong with society specifically when it comes to federal rule, and then how badly did the people mess up when they took over? Because when they took over, what we do see is like things are not going very well. There's new society they're creating is very much going to collapse, and by the end of it, from what we saw, I would assume with all those zombies basically roaming out and wiping out their main army, I'm assuming their society is on the verge of collapse.
Yep. And there's another thing too, like it places the Bill and Frank. God, we are a bit obsessed about this, but honestly, like it is the crux of why this episode does far more poorly. Because if this episode existed in a vacuum without the Bill and Frank episode, I would have been far less annoyed by this episode overall. Because everybody has a horrible ending in this universe. Tess has a horrible ending.
Yep.
The Henry and his kid brother has a horrible ending. The city has a horrible ending. Kathleen Kennedy has a horrible ending. Even the guard that Joel interacted with a little bit and did smuggling shit for has a horrible ending. Everybody has a horrible ending except for Bill and Frank.
Yeah, it's like it's becoming that thing where it's like, okay, like it would be fine if you showed some other people like at least getting by at the very least. But no, everybody's dying horrifically. Like quite horrifically. And it's like, okay. Like it's a stark contrast from where the overall direction of the story is going, where it's like everybody dies horribly. Versus, well, actually those people got to live, happily ever after. It just feels weird in the setting.
It does. It feels off.
Because we're going for a dark, apocalyptic setting. And the darkness of the setting is what makes it feel so bad, makes it feel so dangerous, the world's so, unstable. And that's why, Joel and Ellie's relationship and Joel's protective nature over Ellie is so important, because this world is that bad. Like, it's fallen to shit in a handbasket real quick. And he's basically the only thing standing between her and death.
Yep. And now that we know that there is the option to eat fresh lamb sauteed in wine, it undermines everything.
Yeah, Jesus. Let's talk about, it's like, they're having nice food and the people in Kansas City are being oppressed and raped and shit, and then they suffer a communist revolution, only for that to fail, like all communist revolutions does, to just be devoured by zombies. Like, oh, what a shitty end to go, right?
Yep. I know there's going to be some I told you so's in the comments today. I am going to accept that.
You get a freebie today, chat.
You do. Because now I'm agreeing far more that episode was forced. Because they clearly cut time out of this episode to get that one done. And it clearly breaks with the rest of the universe. Though in my defense, I have no idea what's in this universe, so...
That's okay. It's a fairly mid-tier universe anyway, so you're not missing too much.
These two episodes were a 6, maybe a 7 if I'm being generous, out of 10 tops. Needs more time in the oven.
Yep, not terrible, but a disappointment to be certain.